Hi, and welcome to Take Every Thought Captive, our weekly look at the Catholic intellectual tradition and an exploration of the authors, books, and topics that have shaped Catholic thinking for 2,000 years. My name is Jason Gale, and I'm joined this week by Dr. Benjamin Smith to discuss and continue our discussion on authenticity. Last time we discussed authentic truth, and the time before that we discussed authentic beauty. Now, a main point that we said about both of these is that they are rooted in reality. This is a key aspect to all of these. And so we're going to continue our discussion of the transcendental properties of being. And today we are going to look at authentic goodness. Now, being one of the transcendental properties of being, it is also rooted in reality. So that's a key point to remember as we go through this discussion. But Dr. Smith, in terms of goodness, many times when we speak about goodness, it always leads to some discussion on ethics, which is a very hot topic today. And it's a very difficult one to even form a foundation with somebody to have a productive discussion about ethics. So how can we begin to maybe build a foundation, maybe in our own thinking, so when we speak to other people, we can have this firm foundation to actually make some progress?
Right, sure. So one of the things that's interesting here, Jason, I think, is to think about, well, really to sort of contrast our own time and the sort of ethical dilemma and problem that you're talking about with the sort of classical view of ethics and the classical view of goodness, because they really stand in very stark contrast. It's a very important book written by the philosopher Alastair McIntyre, a book called After Virtue. It's a pretty dense read, but it's been extremely influential. I would say it single-handedly probably relaunched interest in virtue ethics, say outside of the Catholic sphere, in the broader sort of academic community. It's a powerful work. He opens the book with a discussion of the contemporary scene, and he observes that modern man is incapable, we're incapable really in a lot of ways, of entering into a shared ethical discourse, shared ethical deliberation or discussions, as you're talking about. Instead, everything seems to turn into this kind of vilification, accusation, sort of character assassination, that sort of thing, rather than sort of like even a thoughtful, maybe passionate, but thoughtful argument about the good. And what McIntyre says that's especially instructive here is that this is because we've lost the vocabulary and the intellectual sort of structure that made it possible for us to have a shared deliberation, right? And we've replaced that classical tradition with emotivism.
Right. I think that's a key to remember. And this not only affect, I would say, philosophy, but this affected a lot of, even currently affects a lot of catechesis, theology, is this, and it's maybe a broad point to remember, I don't want to get too off topic, but that language kind of forms that infrastructure to good and healthy debate and discussion. And so once you lose that shared language, or you just don't define your terms, we could literally be using the same words and have completely different meanings. And that just does nothing for actually making progress in trying to understand a particular ethical position or to be a proponent or an opponent for one. So that's a very interesting point. I think it's something to remember with more than just ethics here, but for a lot of things.
It's not just a matter of philosophical ethics. In fact, Jason, I would say that this is, in some ways, almost kind of a default position that a lot of people fall back on in ordinary life. I hear this all the time. You pick up emotivism, strains of emotivism, when people use words like, well, I feel like this is the way it should be, or I feel like that's the way it should not be, right? Yeah. Or that just makes me so sad, or that's icky, or whatever. Like those are emotive type words. There's nothing wrong with emotional expressions, of course, but ethics is more than emotion.
Right.
Is what you were to say, right? And so technically, though, emotivism is the view that ethical statements, ethical claims, ethical judgments are merely expressions of emotion. Right? And so when I say, for example, that if I was to say that abortion is immoral, or that adultery is wrong, or something like that, right? What I'm really doing is I'm expressing my feelings about adultery.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right. I'm not actually describing adultery at all. I'm just saying that adultery is something that I have negative feelings about.
Right.
Right. That I don't desire for myself or for others, or I feel that it's something that should be avoided. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it goes back to that underlining premise that we've talked about in the previous two podcasts, that what a thing is lies in the reality of the thing. You know, we have to look at the nature of the thing, whereas emotivism, I guess, building off of Kant, correct, that the thing in of itself, the nature of the thing, if you even want to call it that, lies in however I feel about it, or lies in.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to associate emotivism too closely with Kant,
Right.
Except for what you were saying about like that we don't know the thing in itself. I got that.
Right.
I get you making that connection. Kant would be very worried about making ethics only about emotion. I think you can kind of trace that back more really to the English tradition.
Okay.
You get people like David Hume and Jeremy Bentham and so forth, utilitarians or various forms of empiricists. So if I see something, let's say this is a kind of maybe a little dramatic example, but let's say that I was to view someone being assaulted in a parking lot. Like say I go shopping and I see somebody like really being, seriously harmed.
Right.
If I was to sort of, take a video of that, it was not to intervene. It's kind of a tendency of modern people. But anyways, right? So like, I'm just gonna take a video of this, and then you go back and watch the video. Emotives would say, look, there's no goodness or badness that pops up anywhere in that video, right? It's not a thing in the world. It's not a thing that has any sort of purchase in reality. Now you might say, yeah, but would you want that done to you? And of course, the emotives can say, no, I don't like being hit. I don't like being kicked on the ground. But that doesn't mean that there's something called evil that's attached to that assault.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Right. You can't really get to the nature of an act.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. They would say the only nature there is what can be described through the senses or through science.
Yeah.
But then you say, well, what about all this moral and ethical discourse? Well, we just happen to be the kinds of things that have emotional responses, some of which have a kind of moral overlay. So when I say, stop assaulting that person, that's wrong, right? That kind of thing, right? Then really I'm expressing when I say it's wrong, really I'm just expressing my repulsion to unjust assault. But it doesn't change, it has nothing to do with the underlying reality of the act.
Ah, very good. So we okay, so this emotivism is really taking over our culture and probably all of our ethical discussions. How can we get a firm foundation with ethics, or particularly with goodness?
Sure, yeah, with goodness, yeah. So one thing is to go and ground it in goodness. One thing you could say here, the example of assault's helpful. Let me just give you one other example, and then I can sort of say something directly about goodness. But other examples, if you find out that your spouse is committing adultery, right? And you were to say to your spouse, hey, this is wrong. You must stop, right? Yeah. I'm angry with you for having mistreated me. The emotivist will say, I know you feel that way about it, right?
Yeah.
But there's just nothing wrong in itself, right, with sleeping with somebody other than your spouse. From the emotive's perspective, right? There's nothing it sounds like you're saying, like when you say adultery is wrong, it sounds like you're describing adultery, but really you're just expressing your feelings about it. So that should be, I think, an example that hopefully for most people you're like, well, wait a second, that can't be right. Right? Yeah. Like you want to say there's more to it than just I don't like being cheated on. It is in fact wrong, right?
Right,
but
right.
I don't like it because I perceive it to be wrong, right? Does that make sense? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can see you pointed out a good thing, and I think it makes a lot of us angry when we get that kind of apology. They don't apologize for doing the thing, but they apologize for your feelings. I'm sorry you felt that way. It's like, no, you can't. First off, you can't be sorry for my feelings. Second off, what you did was objectively wrong, objectively evil.
Yeah,
You know,
I'm sorry that made you feel bad. No. My feeling bad is in fact the right response.
Yeah.
Because you did something bad.
Yeah, it's it's one of those things. Like, in all reality, you should be happy that I feel this way because it is an appropriate response to the thing that happened to me. It would be horrible if I did not feel this way.
Yeah, you're
You
like, oh, I've been cheating on you. You're like, oh, okay, whatever. Good.
Yeah.
Yeah, get some ice cream.
That's right. What's for dinner? Yeah.
All right. Well, so if the alternative to this, the way that we sort of get away from that is to return to thinking about, is to base our ethical discourse, our ethical reflections on goodness, as goodness is tied to reality,
Okay.
right? And that's where we kind of find our real foundation. So in the classical tradition, right, goodness is a form of being.
Okay.
Right?
Right.
It's being and reality as desirable.
Mm-hmm.
So this underlies what's called ethical realism or moral realism, right? That is the view that moral claims and moral judgments are based on reality, and that it can be true or false in reference to reality. Now, you might, that's a little maybe jarring in the other direction, because we don't tend to think of reality as desirable, or at least that's not the first thing that we think of, like,
Right.
oh, reality is desirable, or being and good are really the same, right? Sometimes I bring it up that way. Again, this is a very classical position. You can find it in Augustine, Anselm, Aristotle, Plotinus, etc. That being and goodness are really the same. So what in the world does that mean?
Yeah.
Well, when we think about something as good, right? An excellent place to start is to recognize that when we say that something is good, what we're really saying is that it's desirable, right? It's worthy of pursuit, right? When it's undesirable, it should be rejected.
Right.
And that's important, I think, from the start, because there's a tendency, and this is tied directly to Kant, to separate the desirable and the morally good. Right.
Yep.
There's what's morally good over here, and that's kind of like you're gritting your teeth and doing the right thing. And then there's some things that are desirable over here, and that's kind of like, well, they're okay to do as long as you don't break the moral duties or whatever.
Yeah.
Right. But from the classical perspective, and really the Catholic Church has taken this up and adopted it and developed it in its own way. Really, the morally good and the desirable are in fact the same. Okay. Yeah. Right. So we don't need to radically separate these things. So then you ask yourself, okay, well, if we're going to say that goodness, that the good is what's desirable, then you need to ask yourself, well, is something that, this is going to sound a little tricky at first, is something desirable because I desire it, right? Or should I desire it because it is desirable? Okay, I'll say it one more time. So just for our listeners, it might help. Is it the case that something is desirable because it is desired, or should something be desired because it is in fact desirable? Does that see the difference? Right?
Yeah. Break it down now.
So that's what we want to say is not the first option. The first option is I desire it and therefore it has value.
Right.
False. Right. Okay. Something doesn't have value. Something doesn't become desirable merely because I want it. Right? If you think about it, just even for a second, that's obvious when you really think about it, right? Like, yeah, I want to eat I want to eat a bacon cheeseburger, and a large chocolate milkshake, and a large order of onion rings, and a large order of fries almost every day.
Right. Yeah.
That's not desirable. Right. I may desire that, right? But it's not something that is in fact desirable for me. Similarly, and much more importantly, you might desire to steal from your company, to pay off some debts or something like that, or to cover your mortgage for a couple of months or whatever it might be, right? But just because you desire it doesn't make it in fact desirable. It's not choice worthy.
Right. And I think maybe an analogy, looking at that we had talked about, last week with truth, particularly like with the Catholic Church and stuff. The Catholic Church, when she proclaims something to be true, it is not true because she claims it to be, but she claims it to be because it is true. So maybe that's kind of an analogy to understand this particular point with goodness and desirability. What is authentically desirable is what is good for the human person, and just because I desire something does not mean that it is authentically good or authentically desirable.
That's right. You know, and I think this is so important to kind of get that. Thanks for bringing that example in, Jason, because it's just so important to get that pattern of thinking down, right? It's really easy for us to start with ourselves and then shape reality to us.
Right.
And that's very much the modern ethos, right?
Yeah.
That very much is kind of grows out of that Kantian perspective that we talked about before, where mind is the measure of reality. That is not true.
Yeah.
Ultimately, God's mind is the measure of reality. And then there's reality, God's reality, right? The reality that God has shaped and formed according to his own wisdom and power. And then there's us. Okay. So we're like third down the ladder here, right? In terms of our own minds. Now, of course, he's shaped us too, right? And he shaped us to know the world in which he's created. But you gotta flip that script. We have such a tendency to go from our own experience, our own minds, and just sort of project that into reality. Really, what we need to be is, I love these images of Our Lady, where she, I don't know the particular artist or if there's a particular name for it, but very often it's at the Annunciation, where you'll see her sort of kneeling, and like her legs are sort of underneath her, and she has her arms out and her palms up, right? And kind of her head down in a very in a stance, really a gesture of openness and receptivity, right? And that is an extreme image, right, of what should be true of us all the time, right? We're in God's world, right? And what we need to do is to be open to the reality that God has created. And that includes recognizing what's desirable, right? I don't make something desirable. What's desirable is already written into the fabric of reality.
I'll bring up maybe two common experiences. One of maybe somebody that understands this, and probably the contemporary modern person. So say something like adultery. So you have the modern contemporary person has a desire to cheat on their spouse with this other person. They desire that, and they justify it with with whatever reasons, but they recognize something in their desire, and so they say there's not necessarily a problem in my desiring it, but there's a problem in everything else. Whereas the Catholic, they desire that eighth beer or something like that. Seven's okay, right? It's a biblical number. They desire something, but they stop and they ask the question, is this good for me? And if they say, no, this is not really good for me, they say, okay, well, the problem in this situation lies in my desire. It doesn't lie in the thing being presented, but it lies in my desire for it. So
that's very good.
I think kind of those two. So I mean, when you see that, and this is why our society holds up autonomy as the highest, as kind of the highest virtue we can protect. Is this person's ability to choose, even if something is not good for them. I mean, look at the whole transgender issue and things. I mean, we don't have to get into all of it, but I mean, like that's not good for the human person to mutilate their body that way. However, so we say, well, but the person has the right to choose, as opposed to saying, well, maybe the problem in this situation lies in my desiring for this, not in the thing itself.
That's right. Yeah. So there you have to say, I'm the problem, right? Right? My desire is the problem,
right?
And oh my, we hate to say that, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, this goes back to a lot of the issues about original sin and so forth that we've talked about before, and what a real Christian perspective is on ourselves. We have I think a tendency to overrate ourselves more than underrate. But yeah, so once you can flip that script and get it back to thinking, okay, well, goodness and then also conversely evil, right, have to do with reality. So the next, I think, move here is to, once you recognize that desire isn't itself the foundation or the criteria of what's really desirable.
Right.
So that's what we've established so far. The next thing to really recognize is that some things are really desirable and others are not, right?
Mm-hmm.
That is, some things appear to be desirable, and that's why we go after them, right?
Mm-hmm.
But they turn out not to be desirable.
Right.
Or they appear to be desirable just from one aspect and not another aspect, right? We can distinguish I would call it the merely apparently desirable, right, with the really desirable, right? And of course, you ask the question, how do you make the difference? What's the distinction there, right? So let's just maybe look at just the question of adultery again. When you think about adultery, why do people pursue adultery? Why do people commit adultery? They commit adultery because they perceive it to be desirable under some aspect. And right, it might be exciting, right? That might make it desirable.
Mm-hmm.
It might be pleasurable, like
mm-hmm.
Physically pleasurable, emotionally pleasurable, those sorts of things. And taken in isolation, right? You can kind of say, well, pleasure is not evil in itself, right? Pleasure is something that we're designed to kind of seek after, or at least it's associated with our design. But what you want to say is, it only appears to be desirable because taken as a whole, the act is intrinsically evil, right? It's an act of injustice against your spouse.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
So it appears to be desirable, but in fact, it is not. Right?
Yeah.
By contrast, the really desirable, that is the authentic good, is based in the reality of the human person and the reality of the agent's circumstances. So what's really desirable for someone? Aristotle calls this the mean. I don't want to get too far into that terminology. It can be a little misleading or difficult, but what's really desirable is that which is proportionate to who and what I am.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So the reality of who I am and what I am. I've found it convenient over the years to focus on those two words, who and what, to kind of bring out two aspects of the reality about myself. The reality about myself is that I'm a Homo sapien, I'm a rational animal, right? So that's the what, okay? And then there's also the who, right? I am a father, I'm a citizen of the United States, I'm a friend to, several different people, those sorts of things, right? So both in terms of my being, right, my species, and in terms of my kind of individual circumstances.
Right.
Both of those, right, kind of define the reality that is Ben Smith, right? So what's desirable for me is what's fitting and desirable for this being, right? Mm-hmm. So what's proportionate? I think the word proportionate is helpful here, or due, or appropriate, or fitting. Those are helpful words.
Yeah.
I think it's fairly evident once you start to illustrate with examples. So is it proportionate, Jason, would it be proportionate for a father, especially say in a single income home, would it be good and desirable for him to quit his job impulsively?
Absolutely not.
Right. It wouldn't be fitting, right? Because part of being a father is providing for your children, right? Another example would be, what about destroying your intelligence with using drugs? Well, that's not just unhealthy, it's morally bad.
Right.
Leaving aside the question of addiction and culpability, in its species, right? It's a bad kind of action because it's not fitting to a rational being. Right. It's not proportioned to being a rational being. What about would it be okay for me to sell state secrets, right, to the enemies of the United States? No, it wouldn't, right? Because it's not fitting to me as a citizen of the United States of America. Mm-hmm. You following
absolutely. I remember when I was engaged, a great priest that witnessed our marriage. He took me aside and he was saying, the hardest choices you're ever going to have to make are between what is good and what is good. Mm-hmm. And going back to, having the ability to actually examine this and choose correctly. I mean, a choice for a Catholic between a good and an evil, that should be easy. You can never choose the evil,
It should be clear.
It should be at least clear. But a difficult one could be between what is good and what is good. And, so the example I always use, if the local men's shelter said, okay, we need a volunteer to stay every evening, Sunday through Sunday, 5 p.m. to 5 a.m. It would not be good for me to go home and tell my wife, honey, I would love to be home with you and the kids, but, I need to go do this, every night. No, I cannot. It is not good for me
Yeah, it's like given who you are.
Yeah, given who you are. Again, going like you just did, going through those aspects of who I am and what those roles call me to do. It would not be good for me to say, "All right, honey, I'll see you. You know, I get off of work at 4. I got to go to the men's shelter at 5. I'll see you maybe on the weekends." You know, like that would that would be absolutely horrible. I mean, that would be
in for Saturday at 6.
yeah, yeah, I'll pencil you in. Yeah, no, I mean that would be absolutely horrible.
Sure.
You know, again, like you said, you know, going through. So I mean, there's some of those things are, you know, particular to each person, but then there's those, you know, those desirables that are universal. You know,
That's
like
right.
like we had talked about eating the hamburger, cheese, milkshake,
Right.
everything for.
So one thing you can say for sure, right, is like I don't want to kind of spell out the argument for this right now because it'd get too long, but I take it as a conclusion of both faith and right reason that knowing and loving God and enjoying God is the ultimate end of man.
Mm-hmm.
That's objectively so, universally so.
Right.
So even like when you're going to mass, you may not feel like going to mass. I get it, right?
Yeah.
Like it might not be, you're that day, you're just not really into it. But it is objectively desirable for you to be there regardless, right?
Yeah.
And that's tied into the reality about God and the reality about you as a human being, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's not, we could, spend some time explaining that and talking about exploring, and that would actually be really, that's a helpful and useful thing to do, of course. But it's a fact whether I desire it or not. Right?
Yeah.
It's a truth about reality, grounded in reality. So I think when you start to think about it this way, you can see there really are some things that are really desirable and some things that really are not desirable. Now you might sort of kind of go a little bit deeper here and ask, well, okay, what makes it desirable for me to do what's proportionate to me? Mm-hmm. This is being a little philosophical, right? So why is it desirable to do that which is fitting and appropriate? So I actually think, to be perfectly honest, as a moral realist, I have not a lot of patience for this idea that like the moral law is like super vague and people can't figure it. That's malarkey.
Yeah.
I think it's pretty evident, and I think we kind of know it most of the time. There are hard decisions, like a discerning particular maybe circumstances, but
sure.
in terms of the like moral issues, right? I think it's there most of the time. There I'm sure there are exceptions, but most of the time it's pretty obvious. But you might ask yourself, okay, maybe that adultery is wrong is evident because it's disproportionate to being a spouse. It's unfitting to a spouse. Why should I do that which is fitting? Why should I do that which is proportionate to who and what I am? And the kind of deeper answer has to do with you actually, to sound weird, you come to be more, right?
Yeah.
When you pursue that which is proportionate to you. Mm-hmm. The way that St. Thomas and Aristotle talk about this is in terms of actualization, or in terms of perfection. Perfection not understood as sort of like being pristine or flawless, but in the sense of thoroughly done, becoming complete.
Yeah.
I hesitate to use the word fulfillment because, although I think there's a right way to use that word, because that almost in our culture, it kind of like with the term happiness, unfortunately, it almost always becomes kind of this kind of vapid emotionalism.
Right.
Right.
Completely subjective. Yeah.
Yeah, completely subjective. Oh, it's fulfilling to me, meaning like it feels good. No, sometimes going to mass is boring, right?
Yeah.
And it's still more completing of my being to be there, right? It actualizes me as a human being in Imago Dei, to be there even when I'm bored.
Right.
Okay.
Exactly.
Right. And maybe, in fact, especially when I'm bored, right? If I'm there and it's an act of the will because I love you, God, and I'm getting no sensible delight from this at all, right?
Yeah.
And the homily's boring, and that kid up there is wearing tennis shoes that are sticking out under the thing that he wears, whatever, right? Like, you know what I'm saying? Right? This is just not happening today, but I'm here as an act of my will, right? to serve God and to glorify God. Well, that's actually that's perfecting of me as a human being. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a great quote by Chesterton that I can't remember off the top of my head, but goes through its faith, hope, and love. But he says, faith is not really a virtue if it's easy to believe. If something if something is completely evident, it's not faith. You believing it is not a virtue at all. It is when something is unbelievable that faith and you believe it.
Sure.
Faith becomes a virtue. And he was saying the same thing about, when everything seems hopeless, for the Christian to hope, that's when hope becomes a virtue. Same thing with same thing with love. When none of your emotions are there, and you do something for your spouse, you do something for your children, when everything inside of you wants to do something else, wants to go watch football or wants to spend time doing something else, and you set that aside, like that's when it becomes a genuine virtue. And that's when, again, like you said, not necessarily the term fulfillment, but that's when the human person can really flourish in that way. And again, it's according to the nature of the person. It's because of who he is and how he was made and designed.
That's right. Yeah, it's a fulfillment of his character as Imago Dei, right? That is made in the image of God and ordered towards everlasting communion with God and communion with the Holy Trinity. That is in our being. That's what we're ordered to, right? And doing the acts that make me fit for sharing in a Trinitarian life. Begin to actualize me more and more as a human being, right? On the other side of it, vice, right? Say intemperance or wrath or things of that nature, they deform and corrupt my humanity. They don't make you stop being human, okay? Yeah. But it is the case that you are impoverishing your humanity. That's the way I would put it, right? You still fit within the category. Right. But we even recognize this, like in really sort of wildly evil people. We'll say sometimes, man, that's inhuman, right? Yeah. And what we're recognizing there is there's a lack of the being, the completeness of a human there, that this evil act is really bringing out and manifesting.
Yeah, and being a mechanic, my mind immediately goes to cars and those analogies. I mean, a broken down car in your front lawn with like a tree growing through the engine compartment, we still call that a car, when it's sitting next to, the Ferrari in your in the driveway, but they're not. One of them has a lot more actuality to it.
That's right. The actuality of being a car.
Yeah, of being a car. I mean, your car can still barely function on, if it's a 4-cylinder, it can function on 3 cylinders, but it's not going to go very fast. It's going to get horrible gas mileage. It's going to have a lot of problems. So, somebody can, a human person can be filled with vices. It's kind of like, they're running on 2 or 3 cylinders. They're not going to flourish. They're going to have many different issues. And it's going to lead to the overall destruction of the person, even though they don't necessarily lose their nature. It's going to lead to their destruction. So I mean, when we talk about goodness, it really is for that flourishing. I mean, everybody, and we understand this with many different things. We want to function. We want to, and it's not just function, but we want to flourish at the highest capacity. I mean, when you think about the CEO that's, somebody that aspires to be a CEO, somebody that is fixing up a car, somebody that is fixing up a house. They don't want they want to bring it to that place of real life. They want to bring that thing to life, and it's obviously not the same, but it's just very similar to the human person.
I think so. Yeah. In fact, when you look at anything, I would argue that anything that's really desirable, right, really involves an actualization of some sort or the other. Yeah. You think about friendship. Well, very often friendships, can have different characters to them or different points of emphasis. It might be actualization in terms of a shared activity that you both enjoy, in which case it's just pleasure, but that's not bad, right? Like you both enjoy, football or some, some pastime or something. It's actualizing your ability to talk about that thing, to view it, to kind of contemplate it, and so forth. Or it could be more deep, or it could be deeper, right? Like some of our friends who, we say, so and so brings out the best in me, right? What they're doing, like what you're saying there, kind of implicitly, is they help you flourish more as a human being, right? They bring more goodness out of you, that sort of thing. I think even when you're thinking about pleasure, I think sometimes we get just kind of distracted by the issue of pleasure.
Oh yeah.
Pleasure is a form of the good. Sometimes people don't know that. All things considered, doing the right thing and enjoying doing the right thing is really great. All right, like it's not. There's sometimes this image that you have to be like clenching your teeth, but if you're doing the right thing and you're enjoying it, that's great, right? God made goodness and virtue to be enjoyable for us.
The key point there is that the pleasure must be attached to the right thing, because that's where we can. I think that's a common a place that we can kind of come together is, okay, let's recognize, okay, pleasure's desirable, pleasure's good, to some degree, but where we draw the line is, as Catholics or as Christians, is that the pleasure must be connected to the right thing. I cannot seek pleasure for its own purpose, because what if I get pleasure out of, throwing chairs at people or kicking puppies? You would say, no, that is not good. The pleasure you desire, the pleasure you get from that is horribly wrong. And we would even say disordered, which means that A, there's a proper order, and
sure.
B, pleasure is not an end in and of itself, that it has to be attached to something that is already good.
That makes it really desirable, right?
Yeah.
So it needs to, when we think about pleasure, these examples you're using are apropos. The pleasure is really a consequence of an action. It's an accompaniment to an action, but it's not the very action itself, right? And so there's no just action that just is pleasure. Yeah. Right. There's actions that delight or that sadden, right, or grieve or pain, but there's no just pleasure in isolation, pain in isolation. They always go with an underlying action, and really our analysis of whether or not it's good or not really has to do with that underlying action. Pleasure, of course, is always preferable to pain, right? But sometimes doing what's really desirable will be painful. But what makes it good or bad is neither the pleasure nor the pain, but the reality of the action, the reality of the agent. So back again, right, to being in reality. I've heard some people respond to this approach by saying, well, wait a second. People do what's virtuous just because they actually enjoy it, right? So say a mother tending to her annoying child, say the mother is really annoyed, but goes ahead and acts in a loving manner and is compassionate to the child and takes care of the child. And some people say, well, that's because, and then later on she feels good about having done the right thing there. Some people will say in response to that, well, see, she really only did it because of the consequence of the pleasure, right? And I'll say, no, you're misunderstanding. She's pleased with her behavior because she thinks her behavior was right. Right. It's the goodness of the action that gives rise to the feeling of satisfaction for having done the right thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So again, the good is prior to the feeling of it.
Yeah, and you see the converse of it all the time, where when somebody doesn't do the right thing, they feel guilty, they feel bad, and it's only in retrospect that they could say, okay, I did recognize what the right thing was, and I did not choose it, and it is that choice of not choosing the good that makes them feel bad. It's not, so like you said, it's that consequence.
So one of the things, that to kind of tie all this together that's underneath here is, right, was we're pushing, again, both when we talked about truth, when we talked about beauty, now talking about authentic goodness, is pushing it back towards reality, right? Thinking about reality, accepting reality, affirming reality, conforming to the reality that God has made. Sometimes that's hard, right? We don't like it, right? Obviously, this is most evident in the issues, or at least most obvious right now in areas like sexuality. I think it's also evident, to be perfectly frank, in areas about our use of material goods,
Yeah.
our addiction to accumulation, right? Towards greed, what I sometimes call the American vice,
Yeah.
right? Is is contrary to our nature. The rational use of material things is to have to have as much as you need for today and tomorrow, and a decent amount, not endless accumulation, right? And in fact, St. Thomas says, and I think he's right, that it's immoral, right, to have a strong attachment to getting an excess of that. If you end up with an excess, it's a different thing.
Right.
Having a strong attachment, right, is actually bad, right? That's a really strong thing to say, but it goes beyond the reality of our rationality, right, and of the reality of what we really need in life, right, and the real place of material things. Looking at sexuality, right? I mean, Humana Vita. Anytime I ever sort of have a moment where I'm like, have entertain some sort of doubt or something in my faith, one of the things that always comes back to me is just Humana Vita, right? Like,
Yep.
I mean, there are way more important things than Humana Vita, but man, that thing is just so true and perceptive. You know what I mean? The truth about human sexuality is that it is necessarily tied to procreation, right? If it's not ordered towards procreation in one way or the other, there's more to it than procreation. I know that, okay? But procreation is a irreducible, necessary condition, right, of authentic human sexuality. That's the reality about sex and human beings, right? And we don't like that reality,
right?
And so we just ignore it. We just completely ignore it. And you brought up recently this point about I think there was a law maybe passed in Alabama about abortion. Is that right? And somebody was writing. Well, this wrote in, I think, on an internet blog or something, a comment along the lines of, well, this is basically forced pregnancy. Yeah. And if we're going to have forced pregnancy, then men shouldn't be allowed to abandon their children. And I want to say, well, yeah. We've always been saying this, right? Like, that's called marriage, right?
I saw somebody made the argument, if women can choose to abort the baby because it's an inconvenience, why can't men, or why can't the fathers stop paying child support because it's inconvenient? You know, I mean, if we're gonna start basing these arguments on things that are that frivolous or that small, as opposed to getting at the thing itself, then we're in for a world of legislative hurt. I mean, it's just gonna.
Well, and here's the thing, is I bring up that example just to say that we end up having to jump through all these hoops and suffer all of this sociological and psychological blowback. Because we won't accept the reality of the thing, right? That the reality of the thing is it's tied to procreation, it's tied to family life, it's tied to marriage, right? Those are the kinds of things that we just want to ignore it, as much as possible. Again, not to go too far on sexual ethics or issues about greed, but just those are examples, I think, where what you recognize is in our depravity. We very often want unreality, right? We want to live in a world other than the real world. We want to act in a way that's deluded. Not that we consciously think that, but we want to delude ourselves in saying, I can fly, I can, eat glass, I can go completely off of what's sound and true and real, and just do whatever I want.
Yeah, I mean, that they'll never say that. But the reality is that's exactly what they're doing. And the way they just say things like, well, gender is a social construct. That's what they, and well, okay, so is your gender theory. That's a social construct too. So, I mean, so again, you have to go back of, what are we going to base this on? Are we going to base it on society's feelings about this issue at this time? That's not a very firm place to plant your feet. you
Yeah,
know.
that shifted sand, right?
Yeah, or
Or
the one of my favorite books, Relativism, feet firmly planted in thin air. That's kind of where we're establishing ourselves. So I mean, everything can just quickly change and move in directions that again are not rooted in reality. They become just a vice-filled society's delusion.
it's just delusion.
Yeah, I mean that's where we're headed,
And when we look at the rates right now of mental illness, the rates of opioid addiction, the rates of horrific suicide rates that we're going through, maybe we're deluded. Like maybe our refusal to conform to reality is actually bad for us. And this is, I guess, what I want to kind of loop back to and maybe wrap up with a little bit here. It's just to say, like, even though reality isn't always comfortable, even though reality doesn't always fit our emotions at the time,
Mm-hmm.
the truth is that being and goodness are really the same, right?
Yeah.
That is, being is what's really desirable, and God created it that way. And so, when we are pursuing what's real, what's really desirable, we're pursuing a kind of reality that is actualizing, that brings about flourishing, that, in a lot of ways on the front end, sometimes it feels restrictive and challenging, but once you sort of penetrate into it more deeply, what you come to realize is that God has created a reality that is in fact desirable. It's a wonderful reality.
Yeah.
It's a reality that's challenging often, right? But it's a reality that is full of beauty and truth, that's inspiring, that really, the further we go into it and the more we realize it, the more we come to flourish, right? And I think that's not only morally healthy, right? It's also, I think, metaphysically and really spiritually inspiring.
I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about, but one thing I do want to kind of end on, because I think it's a good first kind of starting point, or if it's not, if you're already there, it's a good place to continue, is adoration, because especially if you go for an entire hour, because sure. If you do have those initial emotions, it's very unlikely that those emotions will stay there for the full hour.
That's a good point.
And B, when you're there in adoration, you are there where essence and being are there in the most real way, whether your senses recognize it or not. Again, I think it's a great place to contemplate this kind of aspect of what is the reality that is before me. In St. Thomas, in his beautiful prayers for adoration and benediction, where my senses fail, the eyes of faith tell me that you are there. That the reality that is there before us is Christ Himself, and to sit with that, to contemplate that in silence. Goodness is there, authentic truth is there, authentic beauty is there, and it's only with the eyes of faith that we can see it. You brought this up in I think one of the YouTube videos we shared, that we can understand some things naturally. I can see without my contacts, but when we put on the glasses of faith, how much more clearly we can see everything else. And so, I think adoration's a beautiful place to go to see truth, beauty, goodness. And the amazing thing, like you said, is when we conform ourselves to that reality, we begin to flourish. When we begin to flourish in the way that God designed us, we're able to see the world like Him. And so we're able to see the beauty of the world, the goodness of the world, the truth that exists in the world. And so I want to invite our listeners to really try to remember that basic principle that we've talked about with all these transcendental properties of being, that it lies in the reality. And when we form ourselves and conform our thinking to that reality, we're able to flourish and bring others also into that flourishing. With that, I want to thank everybody for listening. Until next time, God bless.